Did Bolshevik Russia follow the principles of a responsible nation, taking care of its people, giving them rights to free medicine, education, and life? Or did it essentially become a horribly constructed house built off of the instructions of Karl Marx's blueprints on how to create a workers' garment by silencing its people, starving out ethnic groups with man made famines, invading countless countries, and electing extremely corrupt officials? In late May of 1896, a new monarch in Europe was introduced to the throne, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Now, early on, it was very evident that Nicholas would be unfit to rule the Russian Empire. 4 days after Nicholas's coronation, a banquet was held for the people of the Khodinka field area, being given gifts consisting of several breads, sausage, and a commemorative cup. During the banquet, a rumor was spread that there wasn't enough food for everyone at the event, and the cups had gold coins in them, causing 500,000 people to stampede, killing 1,282 people and injuring anywhere between 1,200 and 20,000. After the incident had occurred, the new czar was planning on going to a party in France, and when told of the Khodinka tragedy, it is reported that Nicholas showed little to no emotion and ended up going to the ball anyway, despite being advised not to. This and several factors caused the Russian lower class to resent the monarchist government. In 1905, the plummeting reputation of Tsar Nicholas, numerous defeats in the war with Japan, and harsh treatment towards workers and peasants at the end of the war began yet another problem for the Tsar to deal with: the workings of the revolution. 1905 revolution, led by Orthodox priest Georgy Gapon, communist revolutionary Leon Trotsky, and leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, Pavel Milyukov, consisted of widespread riots, strikes, and assassinations in order to convince Tsar Nicholas to transform the Russian autocracy into a constitutional monarchy or democratic republic. These violent acts, mainly organized by the Union of Liberation, trickled down into a peaceful demonstration in front of the Tsar's winter palace being fired upon by Russian guards, resulting in at least 100 dead and several hundred being wounded. This event being called Krovavoya Voskresenia, or Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday caused consequent widespread worker strikes within the Russian industrial hubs, causing Nicholas to attempt a compromise with the revolutionaries by stating his intention to hire advisors to his government. This failed and the revolution continued. The civil unrest spread throughout the Russian Empire, especially in the Baltic states, Finland, Georgia, and Poland. This widespread unrest caused the anti revolutionary Black Hundreds to stage pogroms against the Russian Jews and intimidate socialists into silence. However, the revolution began boiling over in mid 1905 when units of the Russian army began rioting along the Trans Siberian Railroad, and the crew of the battleship Potemkin mutinied. Nicholas announced the elections for the advisory assembly promised earlier in the revolution, but instead of calming the peasants, this stimulated the revolution, starting more railroad strikes and general strikes, as well as the formation of Soviets or workers' councils in the cities Ivanovo, Voznesensk, and St. Petersburg. Initially organizing worker strikes, but as more social democrats began joining, the St. Petersburg Workers' Council began taking the role as a revolutionary government. Soviets in Moscow and Odessa began following St. Petersburg. In October of 1905, the sheer intensity of the revolution finally convinced Tsar Nicholas to issue the October Manifesto, promising the formation of a constitution and establishment of a parliament, or Duma. This led the radical opposition unsatisfied, declining Tsar Nicholas's offer and continuing the strikes and riots. Towards the end of 1905, the government arrested the Soviet's chairman J.S. Khrushchev Nozar and Leon Trotsky. The last attempt of a major strike was held in Moscow. Barricades were erected and fighting started before it was put down. In Finland, order was nonetheless peacefully restored, and military expeditions to the Baltics, Georgia, and Poland began brutally crushing opposition. By the beginning of 1906, the 1905 revolution was marked a failure. Russia was left somewhat stable, and the peasants were left bitter. 6 years before the beginning of World War I, Nicholas called upon Siberian mystic Grigory Rasputin to heal his son of his condition. Rasputin later told the Romanovs that their destiny was inevitably tied to him, influencing Nicholas and his wife to soon grant Rasputin a seat in the royal family. His high end and licentious living, partying, drinking, and sleeping with many women underneath Nicholas's nose became a known public scandal in 1911, resulting in the Tsar expelling Rasputin from St. Petersburg. But Nicholas's wife, Alexandra, invited him back to the capital. When World War One ignited 3 years later, the fact that Russia would quickly be defeated was evident. Lack of supplies, incompetent generals, hundreds of thousands dead in the first year, and a failed East Prussian offensive. While Nicholas was fighting the war as a general, Empress Alexandra was running Russian internal affairs. Because Rasputin was her personal advisor, he took the chance to extort his power, electing corrupt cabinet ministers, appointing church officials, and intervening in Russia's military, harming the Russian war effort. On December 29, 1916, a group of high-ranking conservatives, including Prince Felix Yusupov, member of the Duma Vladimir Purushkevich, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, formed a plot to assassinate Rasputin in order to relieve Russia of political strife. But this didn't help Russia's case at all. The damage was already done. Government corruption, economic failure, lack of food, and major losses in the war began civil unrest far worse than in 1905. And in 1917, three Bolshevik revolutionaries named Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin took to factories and farms in order to gain the lower class. Strikes for high wages started, and more than 30,000 men and 100,000 women were picketing in front of factories and marching down the streets of St. Petersburg. The government and Duma took no notice of the demonstrations and only attempted to prevent strikers from entering the city center. By the next day, about 30% of all workers in the city were still striking, and a number of strikers were successful in making it to the city center. And later that day, college students joined the demonstrations. But the main focus point of the strikers was the food shortages instead of the war. By the third day of the revolution, strikes became general and protesters became aggressive, raiding and disarming the police, making it obsolete, and soon demonstrations became armed uprisings, and Cossack units guarding the city became friendly towards protesters. Nicholas, becoming intimidated towards the intensified uprisings, instructed the military governor of the city to suppress the strike and gave the prime minister the ability to discontinue the Duma. Imperial guards were ordered to fire on demonstrators, but that did little to slow the onslaught. Imperial guards soon deserted and joined the protests, marking a full revolution. A task force of around 1,000 troops attempted to arrest the mutineers, but failed and took up arms with the revolutionaries. At this point of the St. Petersburg uprising, the main goal of the government was to hold out until more imperial forces could arrive. Government officials tried to hunker down in the Winter Palace, but were arrested and imprisoned by strikers. As a result of a successful revolt in the capital, revolutionaries soon became intoxicated, making it easy for an organized loyalists to reassert power. Revolutionaries demanded that the Duma assume power of the country, but Duma leaders hesitated. Instead, they tried convincing the Tsar to compromise with the revolution, but the Tsar denied the severity of the revolution. But after being told that the monarchy was being threatened by the Petrograd garrison, Nicholas ordered another task force to enter the capital. But the soldiers never entered the city. The first units were blocked from the capital by railway workers, and the others never came. That there really wasn't a point in using the military to restore power. After realizing the magnitude of the revolution, Tsar Nicholas was abdicated and exiled to Tobolsk. Alexander Kerensky took power of the provisional government, and full-scale war began. Riots in Moscow. Even though the rights to free speech were protected by Soviet law, anyone who criticized the Soviet regime was rather executed or this wasn't true. Anyone who criticized the Soviet regime was either executed or, during Stalin's reign, sent to labor camps in Siberia, infamously known as gulags. In 1917, Soviet officials declared in Soviet law that the regime was above the law, and any political enemy was to be eliminated without trials, and opposing speech was banned. This law was enforced by numerous secret police agencies over the 69-year period of communist rule. VCHKV, OGPU, the NKVD, and the KGB. The Soviet Union failed in their responsibility to their people by providing lackluster services promised by Soviet law or plainly ignoring these promised rights.